Good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome. Let me begin with acknowledging that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I'm Rochelle Owen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Sustainability here at Dalhousie University, and your host for tonight's topic of conversation, clean energy for the next generation. Rapid climate change has become an undeniable reality for the modern world. With that comes irreversible consequences from rising sea levels and extreme weather to biodiversity loss and worsening health for humanity and other planetary species. These are signs that radical change is needed and fast. The United Nations estimates that energy production in the world's cities accounts for 60% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. To find a solution, experts, policymakers, and industry leaders are turning their attention to the management and development of new and renewable energy sources, while also finding ways to minimize their environmental and social impact. This week in Nova Scotia, the province launched a climate risk assessment and a renewed climate change plan for the province. Dalhousie's own climate plan also notes warmer, wetter, wilder weather for our region and the need to rapidly deploy adaptation and mitigation strategies. So tonight we're going to talk about an exciting topic of renewable energy with the following faculties of engineering, architecture and planning, and science, and of course our office here. And we'll tackle the question, what role does Dalhousie play in this? How can we help transition our fossil fuel-driven economy into a clean economy powered by renewable energy? So please join me in welcoming our guests here tonight. So seated here is Dr. Chris Burns. And Chris is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Novononics. He studied physics at St. Francis Xavier University before pursuing graduate studies at Dalhousie, where he co-developed the breakthrough ultra-high precision telemetry technology with Dr. Jeff Don. As Tesla's first technical hire in Canada in 2015, Dr. Burns leads projects in materials and battery characterization with the goals of selecting EV and ESS battery chemistry and materials. Welcome, Chris. And next is Christine Macy. Christine is a professor of architecture at Dalhousie. Christine is an architect, historian, and author of numerous books and publications, including Architecture and Nature, Creating the American Landscape, co-authored with business partner of Affilium Limited, Sarah Bonamesson, which received the Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from Society of Architectural Historians. And our final panelist tonight is Dr. Lucas Swan, a professor of mechanical engineering and the principal investigator at Dalhousie University's Renewable Energy Storage Laboratory, where his research focuses on unique, elegant, and robust solutions to transition from fossil fuels to efficient electrification. With numerous years of experience with battery energy storage and renewable energy, Lucas has worked throughout the world and as a consultant to a wide variety of companies ranging from startups to multinationals, and served as an expert witness to the International Court of Arbitration in Geneva. So for tonight's proceedings, we're going to start with a few opening remarks from our panelists, and then we're going to have a couple of warm-up questions that I'll lob over to our accomplished group. And then, of course, you may know that you can send in questions online, and then I'll have this phone, and I won't be texting my family. I will be receiving your questions, though I suspect we may have more questions than we have time, so we'll do our best to filter through them. And so we have about a half an hour for that as well. So without further ado, I'm just going to move over here. I brought a clipboard, what I think is appropriate for today's topic. Okay, we're going to start with Christine. Do you want to provide an opener for 3 to 4 minutes?
How's that? Can you hear me? Good. Okay, my background is architecture and planning, so I'm going to talk about sort of where the energy hits the road or where things land. So modern society, as you know, is powered by fossil fuels, mostly for industry, also for transportation, for residential, commercial, and also for internet increasingly. But it's not only powered, but it's been shaped by our energy use. Cheap fossil fuel literally changed the form of human settlements. In the post-World War II era, North American cities greatly expanded their footprint, creating urban sprawl. We hollowed out our cities, historic cities like Halifax, with parking lots, and we changed the character of urban streets from being public spaces to being traffic corridors. Freestanding houses use a very large percentage of total energy just to heat and cool themselves. When you add this to the energy costs of moving around such sprawling cities, that total energy use dwarfs the energy use by industry. So my point here is that the current climate crisis is a bigger problem than just replacing fossil fuels with clean energy sources. Replacing gas-powered vehicles with ones using electricity is a great start, but we could do more. We could rethink the concept of car ownership. Could it be shared? And the number of vehicles in cities. We could redesign neighborhoods so that all daily needs are within walking distance. We could bring services closer to where people live, instead of expecting them to drive great distances. And instead of centralizing schools so kids have to be bused, how about spreading them through neighborhoods so kids can walk? There are so many negative impacts from urban sprawl and single-use zoning, too much time in cars, and all the negative health consequences, both mental and physical, from isolation and inactivity. The distance working that was ushered in by COVID is a good start. But now that we're aware of being up against the wall of climate change and the end of the use of fossil fuels, we also have the opportunity to come up with more profound changes that could greatly improve the quality of life for Canadians who live in urban conglomerations, which are most Canadians. Is the end of the fossil fuel era an opportunity to rethink the shape of cities?
Thank you for your opening remarks. I'm looking forward to asking questions. Chris.
Sure. So thanks for being here tonight, despite the weather outside. I think when we look at the transition of clean energy technologies, Christine is talking about things that we need to move towards as a society that are going to take significant time, significant change in not just the way we do things, but how we think about things, right? And so this transition is going to be phased to the types of things that she spoke about. But where we live today and where we sit today is trying to find some of those immediate impacts. And so at Novonix, to give people some context, we work on battery materials and technologies that are really focused for the vehicle and grid energy storage markets. And we really see those as very coupled in terms of how they're going to support the transition away from fossil fuels. Because as I'm sure Lucas will speak about, we need to drive renewable energy generation onto the grid, and that needs to be coupled with storage. And there's going to be a huge array of energy storage technologies that are going to play a role in that. But today we're living in the world of lithium, right? And lithium-ion technology has become pervasive across everything we do. It's in the mic I'm holding, it's in all of your pockets, it's everywhere. And it's because this technology has become so relevant and so capable to serve the needs of such a wide array of requirements and applications, from consumer electronics to electric vehicles to long-term energy storage. And now our industry in the lithium-ion space is plagued with the challenge of how can we support this rapid transition in terms of deploying enough energy storage to help transition the way we think about energy. And not just doing that to reach that scale, because it's currently an industry that's completely controlled by the Asian market, where it's grown over the past decade to the scale that it is. But how can we now do that in North America? And how can we think about doing this in responsible ways and looking forward to the changes that we need to make as a society? But I think we're going to see huge waves in terms of technology evolution, starting where we are today with lithium ion, all to help solve these problems that become more and more tenable through technological advancements over time.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Lucas?
Good evening, everyone. I don't usually show up with speaking notes. It's not my style, but I was told that this was an open dialogue, and if anybody here has worked with me before, you know that I've got a pretty, broad spectrum of research interests, so I thought I'd try to tackle a few. And one of the easiest ways, as any professor knows, to do that is to parse the language that was given to you and work from it. So I'm going to use some keywords. First is energy. You're all here because you're interested in energy, and you need it. You need it for virtually everything you do. It's important to you. And make no mistake, our population's growing. Our wealth is growing. I certainly would hope to make more money in the future than I do right now, and it is strongly correlated with increased use of energy consumption. And so I don't think the question is really, can we turn around the energy consumed by the population in the world right now as a whole? It's how can we do it in a lower impact and more efficient conversion manner? That's the things I want to tackle. The word clean gets thrown around a lot, but I think what we should really be saying is things like low impact, because everything has an impact. Nothing has zero impact. And to hold any technology or technique or method to a bar that says no impact just means it'll never get done, and we'll remain in the status quo where we are today, which I don't think is very good for us moving forward. The next word I heard in the introduction was next generation. Now, I think in a technological sense, that just means the next thing that's coming out, but I've started to think generationally as I've become older. I had a birthday 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it caused me to sit down, think about generations. I have a younger generation. Some of you are an older generation than me, but there's so many more coming. And I realized that things change rather slowly. I bought an electric car 10 years ago. I started setting up wind turbines 10 years ago. And here we are today with all the same sort of problems. So I've had to grow accustomed to the fact that it takes time. And I think the takeaway from that is that although we might make mistakes, we should make decisions early on and go for it. Give it a try. Take some risks, because if they pan out, we're going to do a lot better. Sitting around and waiting is not my style, and I don't think that it'll benefit us in the long term to do that. Another one that came up, Rochelle brought up, was minimizing impacts. And we often think today in ecological or environmental terms all the times, but it can mean a whole lot of things. It doesn't always mean that. So, for example, I think minimizing impact might be to create faster pathways to get things done. Make decisions that support efficiency of operation, maybe reduction of noise, or faster implementation of technologies, or scalability of those technologies. So if something works, that you can redeploy it again and again and again, faster to have that rolled out quickly, instead of waiting on perhaps a mega project to come through in the long term, which may or may not work. There was the word that came up that was transition. And to me, right now, all of your energy needs must be met essentially in real time. When you want them, you demand that that energy be converted and supplied. So the lights, we just can't deal with them going off right now. We'd all have to leave. That's a Dal requirement, I think, that we'd have to leave. So this is a problem for us, and historically we've always relied on energy in real time, and particularly what I call stored energy. So examples would be your gasoline tank full of gasoline, or a big pile of coal sitting out in some yard somewhere in Trenton. And they just sit there and they wait for you, and the moment you want them, you run them through a conversion and you get that energy. And this is what we built our society, as Christine said, on this, 100%. And now we're talking about going to renewables, and intermittent or variable renewables like sun and wind. And I think we can categorically agree that there is no sun out right now, right? It might be windy, it might not be windy, but there's definitely no sun. And so not only do we take an incredibly energy-dense pile of coal that we can burn anytime we want, and it just sits there for months otherwise, and we move to these things, these intermittent renewable resources that are low density. And that means we need lots and lots of wind turbines, lots and lots of solar panels to collect them over large areas. And society's relatively uncomfortable with these concepts. They like one power plant positioned somewhere where you can't see it, preferably. But that doesn't work. It's not going to work anymore, so get used to it. And the intermittency will need to be dealt with by energy storage, which mitigates the temporal differences between when that generation is available versus when you demand that energy be supplied. We demand these lights stay on right now so we can have our talk. We're not going to wait for the sun to come out to do it. Technology is another word that was important, and I like to think of technology in time scales. So we have things that are very short. I think of those as power technologies. You want your power drill to work, you want your cell phone to work. I think in longer energy scales, you want to make sure that tomorrow your house is warm, your building's lights are on, things like that. But then there's strong seasonal scales, and we really haven't learned to deal with those in terms of renewable energy yet. That's forthcoming. But I do propose, as was mentioned earlier, that electrification is certainly the way to solve this. Moving your loads towards electrification is important because it is the ubiquitous energy transfer medium. We all have electricity in our buildings and our homes, and you can plug and play anything you like with it. You can plug in any type of renewable, you can plug in any type of load. And other technologies don't have that benefit moving forward, so I'm certainly a proponent of that. That's led to significant demand or demand soaring in renewables and storage. And this is great because it leads to new manufacturing and new need for raw resources and materials. And Nova Scotia and Canada as a whole is a rich nation in raw materials and the ability to manufacture. And so I think getting into these new technologies is really important. And I was very wrong about this a few years ago. In fact, Chris brought up that the Asians really beat us to market, and they built a phenomenal battery, and they're really, really good at it. And I thought there's just no place for Canada to play. But I had some very smart people sit in my office in the last few years tell me, well, you just don't understand the scale of it. And I realized after speaking with them that they were right, that the forthcoming scale of energy products that are needed in Nova Scotia and Canada and beyond are so big, we're going to have to build it here. We can't rely on other people to build it for us. But that's an opportunity for us to do it domestically, to use our own resources, our own materials, and our own labor to build it. So I think that's pretty neat. And finally, it was mentioned that Dalhousie works in this area, and I'm very proud of all of the research that's coming out of Dalhousie, and it spans a pretty broad spectrum, and I'd like you to know how broad. From the far end of the generation, being perhaps wind in Nova Scotia, till the other end of the spectrum, which might be, say, electric vehicles or electrification of the marine fleet. Well, lobster's a big thing as an example for Nova Scotia, and we were just recently tasked to look into how to electrify lobsters so we don't have to burn diesel to get them anymore. So this is all really fun stuff, and I play a role somewhere right in the middle, which is energy storage, trying to mitigate those differences between when that generation is available and the needs and desires of people just like you and you and you that need that energy exactly when they want. Thank you.
All right, excellent. I know we're going to have some off-script questions. I have a bunch already. Okay, but for our starter questions, Christine, from an architectural perspective, what does an energy efficient city look like?
I think the single most important thing is not taking the status quo for granted. So you mentioned, Chris, that it takes a long time to change the nature of cities. But as a historian, I can say some confidence that the post-war period in North America totally transformed North American cities from being basically urban apartments, streetcars, and trains. Very focused centers. Within 20 years, it became a suburban sprawl connected by interstate freeway systems, highways, and spreading. What that did is that meant people had to use a big chunk of that energy, basically get from here. And with that comes an ideology of a freestanding house, which is a huge heat, just throws heat off. And is built in a way that's very economical, very cheap. At that time, a lot of people made a lot of money. It's not insulated. So I think demand management has to be part of this solution. I think if we just put the template of new technology on the status quo, we're actually not dealing with that fundamental problem, which can significantly reduce utilization and, I think, make a better city. So I think an energy efficient city looks like neighborhoods that you can walk around to get most goods and services, using electrification for public transit to get around, lots of active transit routes and many less cars, and car share is the predominant model for autos. Now, those cities exist. Where are they? Where have you seen one like that? Any guesses? Copenhagen? Another one? Amsterdam? You can name just about any European city from Lisbon to Warsaw, and you're seeing the exact same strategies play out. And from Stockholm to Palermo in Sicily, the exact same strategies are playing out where they're restricting cars, connecting things by transit, and now they're starting to forbid short-term flights. That's part of the solution. And of course, Europe's facing a huge energy crisis now because they can't get the gas they need with the war in Ukraine. So it just shuts down and says, okay, so how are we going to do demand management? And try to get the resources where we need them. Now, I do agree that I think within a generation, it's amazing what you can do, and I totally believe in technological solutions for technological problems. But I'm not so sure about technological solutions for social problems, and I don't think we're very good at knitting those two pieces together. So I think a city that's energy efficient looks like denser housing, more varied and vibrant neighborhoods, more diversity, more accessibility, and the right to the city available to a wider range of people because young people and old people alike can actually move around it. You don't have to be a car owner, and you don't spend all your time dropping your kids off and picking them up.
Thanks, Christine. Chris, Novonix is delivering smart battery materials. How do you source the materials in a sustainable way?
So that's a really huge challenge for the battery industry now. And Lucas brought up this concept of clean. And if you look back over the past, let's say 3 to 5 years, you'll find articles in Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about clean cars, dirty batteries, right? And you still have the same concept, for example, here in Nova Scotia, clean cars, dirty grid, right? But when we look at the battery sector more generally in terms of the materials we need, we have so many hurdles from sourcing materials, accessing mines, building new mines, through to processing. And the challenge of doing this type of work in the Western world, frankly, is what drove scale into Asia, to lower cost markets where regulations were not as high. And this is what's allowed lithium-ion technology to become so prolific. Last year was the first year ever this year, I guess, is the first year ever that battery costs have gone up in lithium-ion technology, right? Coming down from thousands of dollars a kilowatt hour to about 140 and now back up to 150. And this is because we're seeing this demand come. But a lot of that cost reduction has come through shortcuts, right? And it's come at the expense of the idea of clean or safe or sustainable materials production. And now as we try to transition the supply chain here into the Western world, as Lucas said, I mean, the scale of the demand is unbelievable, right? And the number of battery plants that need to be built is unbelievable. And then you have to look one level up and say, where is all that material going to come from? And how is all of that material going to be sourced in an ethical way? And this is where I think we have a great opportunity living in the time that we do, where we have societal change. We have people who are going to make their consumer decisions motivated by these types of arguments, ESG profiles, carbon intensity, ethical sourcing strategies. We have private sectors, companies that are forcing these mandates and committing to these causes. And now we have the government coming to step in. And, as is the case typically here, the U.S. will lead a lot of this with a bigger balance sheet and more things happening. We do a lot of work in the U.S. And so things like the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed there, or is proposed there, it's putting so much capital into projects that can meet these requirements in North America, cleaner materials that we can scale sustainably. And not just because we need them to be sustainable, but we simply need larger scale, right? So we've always focused at Novonix around technologies that are going to be lower impact, to use that word, right? Whether that means carbon intensity, whether that means emission profile. And another way we think about things is we want longer performance cycles out of our materials and out of our products. I think something that goes so underappreciated in this race to cost down materials and cost down batteries, we talk about, and I just quoted these numbers of dollars per kilowatt hour, but how long does the battery last, right? So life cycle is so critical, and now that we're not talking about phones and laptops and things that actually could stay in service for 10 or 20 or more years, well, you need to make sure the batteries last that long. And so I think that's something that we've always stayed focused on, and we're starting to see more and more thought towards, is making sure that when we make a battery with hopefully materials that are sourced ethically, low impact, we can also keep that battery in service as long as possible. You know, recycling and things like that are going to play huge roles in becoming, in supporting a circular economy within this sector. But the best thing we can do is make sure that these energy storage assets last the duration of the applications and deliver us the lowest cost and also the lowest impact over time. And so there's so much work being done now in North America to try to understand how we can adapt technologies that have scaled in other markets to things that we can really support, permit, and stand behind as technologies that will support the North American and global market.
Thanks, that was very comprehensive. We have a lot of questions coming in already. So Lucas, I'm going to give you the last warm-up question, and then we're going to change to the audience questions. So what is the future relationship between energy and society, especially considering our knowledge of its impacts?
That's so focused.
I've got a different one if you want.
You could fire away. Well, I think I addressed that a little bit right at the beginning. You know, there's more of us every year. I just looked it up today. We're over 38 million people. 10 years ago, we were 33. It takes energy. So we got to make it and generate it and convert it from clean resources or renewable resources, and we need to do it efficiently. If you falter on either of those two things, it won't work out really well.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to start reading from my phone here. So our first question here. Cars spend most of their time parked. What is the potential for electric cars to serve each household's battery storage needs in a future more dependent on intermittent renewable energy?
I could speak briefly here about the example of what's being rolled out in Singapore and in Taiwan of electric scooters. And they have like charging stations where you don't actually charge up your individual battery. Take the scooter there, pull into a station, put in your battery, pull out that battery. That's a little harder with car batteries. I think they're just a little heavier. But thinking about that kind of model where you may own the car or you may rent the car, but you can always, you know, have the battery just swapped out where it's being charged at the equivalent of like a service station. The other, I think, big advance we're seeing in some places, not as much here successfully, is the notion of car share. But that can't work if everyone's spread over great distances. It works within a small area for last minute, and then it has to be connected to bigger linkages, like with trains.
Thanks. I heard this at a meeting recently, and this relates to this question. And somebody said, well, if I got the Ford F-150 and I had, you know, the hurricane came and I had the battery charged, and then I decided to use the battery, you know, if it had that capability to charge things in the house, and then I drain the battery, then I have tons of steel sitting there that can't move because I just drained the battery. So what's your thought about, you know, the dual relationship between an electric battery in a vehicle serving a house needs and an outage like a hurricane, for example?
Couple quick comments. I think that I think there's such a critical interplay to vehicles to the grid, and I'm sure Lucas can speak to kind of some of the challenges that we're going to see from an integration standpoint. But thinking about the technology standpoint, Battery swapping is great for kind of micro-mobility applications, but it ties back to something I was just talking about, which is longevity of these assets, right? Because one of the challenges with swapping as a business model is the company has to own all those batteries, right? You know, if I sell you a car with a battery in it, it's all off my balance sheet and it's onto yours, you paid me for it. If I sell you a Ford F-150 and I maintain ownership of the 160 kilowatt hour battery, well, Ford's got a lot of money in batteries floating around on other people's four wheels, right? And so it's a challenging model, but it goes back to needing batteries and being able to say that you're going to recognize the cost of those batteries or the value of those batteries over 10 years or over 20 years. And I think that integration of vehicles to the grid is going to be so important, and it ties to the idea of our sprawled grid network and instability that lives within our network. But you have to address your issue, you have to have energy generation as well, right? So if you have solar panels on your roof, then during the day after the hurricane, it's always beautiful, right? The sun is out, power's on, you're charging everything up, right? And even when you look on the personal economic side, if you have an electric vehicle, so I have a Tesla, I have a 100 kilowatt hour battery sitting in my driveway, why would I spend $10,000, $15,000 to put a 10 kilowatt hour battery in my basement, right? When the 10 kilowatt hour battery might be 12 hours of backup, well, the 100 kilowatt hour battery is days of backup. How frequently is that really going to be the issue? But all of this comes back to this idea now of longevity, where if you're going to plug your car in every day and on a smart grid it's going to get utilized and you're commuting, and you know, in our urban sprawl life of, you know, Nova Scotia's not like this, but in the States you're driving 30, 50 miles one way to work, all of a sudden you're talking about cycling your battery every day, every other day. And these ideas of batteries lasting 1,000 cycles, it's only a few years. It's not enough for vehicle applications. And so that's why we're seeing this huge push toward longer life, and it's something we've stayed so focused on.
Great, thanks. There's a question here for you, Lucas. You mentioned marine electrification. Are there any other ocean-related areas you are doing research in? There's so much talk about offshore wind. What are the opportunities seen in Canada?
Well, we're doing work in all of the above, which is kind of fun. That's why I come to work each day. It's really, really great. We are working in V2G right now. We are working in marine electrification to reduce the diesel consumption of our marine fleets in Nova Scotia, which, you know, marine's a huge thing here. So that's a very domestic topic for us, and it doesn't apply everywhere. The seaboard, the eastern seaboard and the western seaboard of North America are limited in length, even though they seem big. There's a lot of people in between. So we're certainly working in that area, and we are very excited about offshore wind energy for Nova Scotia. We're starting a new study on that right now. It's going to cost more than onshore because it's difficult to get out there and do installations. That said, it comes with a few benefits, and we've been asked to quantify those, such as, and I think you can relate to this, there's no undulations in the ground, there's no trees or edges or anything like that to work around. So the wind flows freer and more smoothly throughout a 24-hour period, and all that is advantageous for turning it into what we would call baseload electricity generation to meet our fundamental power requirements throughout a 24-hour period. So there's all kinds of advantages that come with that, and it's not lost on me that also we can't see them. Let that soak in for just a second, because I think that's principally people's problem with onshore wind energy, is that they can see it. And we probably need to get over that hurdle and accept the fact that if we're going to ask our energy providers to do so with low-density renewable energy, that's what a renewable energy is low density, that we should see it. We should see it positively. And I like to tell people that if they can see a wind turbine in the province from their house, it's very likely that it is powering their house, because generation of electricity goes to meet the nearest load. And once it meets that load, it will then move further back in the network to meet the next load. And so the obvious example from that is that if you have solar on your home and you generate enough to meet your home's needs, it goes out to that nice little transformer on the street and then heads in right into the next home to help them out as the nearest spot. And so I think people that are located near renewable energy can be very proud of the fact that it's probably going directly to their house, even if, you know, we say it's going to all of Nova Scotia.
Thanks, Lucas. This one, Christine, I think if you want to weigh in, and then others. Yesterday, the province released its climate change plan for clean growth. Reaching net zero of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is a key theme. Nowhere did the plan acknowledge any challenges associated with Nova Scotia's population growth to 2 million people by 2060. Are these two goals compatible? And how might we service the energy needs of 1 million new people in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it relates a bit to what Lucas has been talking about. You think more people, more demand for energy. But that's not the only slider on the equation. There's a lot of other levers that can be slid up and down. One I was talking about earlier, demand management. Another one is our societal frame of mind, developed in the immediate post-Second World War period, that has all these assumptions with it that actually we don't like. We like some things. We like living independently in nature, but we get older and suddenly we don't want to be on top of that mountain anymore in a single house. We don't like being a wife that has to carry around all these kids everywhere, and the fact that snow days come and then people can't even do their work because they're taking care of the kids. There's a lot of things we don't like, but that's kind of naturalized. And then we sort of fetishize the things we do like. So I think this can change very rapidly. Society can change unbelievably rapidly on things where there's a large social mobilization. We've seen that in all kinds of attitudes, differences in the society, to the naturalization of people with different abilities, to issues around LGBTQ, to issues around racism. Those changes can happen very quickly. So I think if we're going to take this energy challenge seriously, I think we got to move all the levers on that chart totally. Growth, great. Technological development, wonderful. Challenges around sourcing, great. Dealing with the problems of how do you store this, understanding the grid. Frankly, if we're going to succeed, we have to move all of those. And part of succeeding is Nova Scotia growing in its population, but not following the status quo. And you can see all the resistance about denser growth. You can see the resistance about reintroducing collective transit. If those kinds of things can be happening in more efficient ways and more active transit and reducing the prominence of automobiles, you then suddenly have all this capital you can work with and all this reduced energy load that then you can put where it's actually valuable, in boats, in centralized urban transit, not in just replicating our current models. I think you can really have both, but you need actually social recognition that you've got to move several levers on that chart.
Great, thank you. The questions are piling in here, everyone. Are there any alternatives to lithium storage on the horizon?
I'm sure Lucas will weigh in as well, but I think there's lots of energy storage technologies that are going to be an important part of this transition, right? And the question is, which horizon do you want to focus on? I think that based on the scale and the capability of lithium-ion batteries, they're going to remain the dominant energy storage technology for a significant period of time. Because with scale comes in better costs, comes more investment in improving the technology further, right? And even when you look at lithium-ion batteries, there's still stages of evolution in front of us over the next 20 years to really maximize the potential of lithium-ion alone. But we were just speaking before the panel about the rise of sodium-ion batteries. We were speaking about flow battery technologies. There are companies working on gravity-based storage systems. I mean, there are no wrong answers, but you have to make sure you're solving for one of the real problems. I think that's the most important thing.
I concur.
I like your efficiency there. Okay, we do have a number of hydrogen questions. I'll try to roll them a couple in here. What role do you see hydrogen in terms of energy storage, as part of the energy mix, in vehicles, power production?
Okay. I'm not sure yet. It's a low efficiency solution. And you've heard me say I don't think low efficiency solutions are going to cut it. But there may be some difficult areas to target with high efficiency solutions, which are generally quite expensive per unit storage. So something like seasonal storage aspects, where we overgenerate greatly in the summertime with solar and redeploy that into the wintertime, requires a technology that can store massive amounts of energy. It can accumulate energy that we might otherwise throw away, meaning excess in the summertime, and it can hold on to it for long durations, meaning months, without losing a whole lot of it, which we would call standby losses. And so it may have a role to play there. Another role it could play might be in cargo ships or long-haul transports, where I've had students study what it would take to get across the Atlantic Ocean. And it takes a lot of energy, and we move all of our goods around that way. It's a very important market, and I don't think it's one that lithium-ion batteries are going to address. So I see that as a real opportunity for that technology to step in. But competing against smaller consumer devices or passenger vehicles or even at your home, I just don't think it's going to cut it. I love to make a joke in my energy storage class about your cell phone, and wouldn't it be great if it had a flywheel in it, except for you let go it might spin, or if you had some other combustion technology, you'd hold it up to your ear and it would go, it just wouldn't work very well. So we're stuck with that one, and that's great. It's a fantastic technology, lithium-ion batteries in cell phones. But clearly there are different applications, and some of them will require different technologies, and we have to look for those opportunities. The low-hanging fruit is right in front of us, and we're taking advantage of that today and will be over the forthcoming decades. But there are other things that are harder to displace that people aren't talking about very much right now. I just gave you a few examples, and it might play a role in that.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to give this question to all three panelists, and it's with approximately 40% of Nova Scotians living in rural areas. What shift will we see in the near future on a rural front?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think Nova Scotia has a huge strength of having smaller scattered communities in a village structure. First, we don't use it very well, for example, because even in a place like Sydney, we're putting the hospitals and the schools and things not in the center of town. Why do you have to drive out to them? You got a beautiful little village. Why put old folks' homes on the periphery? So if we can see what's right in front of us, in our nose, we can get things within a walkable radius. Now, the other thing you see in rural Nova Scotia is solar panels going up everywhere. Everywhere. And people, mostly they're just thinking their pocketbook, and there's been some government support for that, and there starts to be some startup companies, spreading that around. And I think that's a great thing, because a huge amount of energy consumption is used in the household. The biggest difference, though, would be a robust provincial program around insulation. Because as we live in older houses, it's equivalent, most of these older houses are the equivalent of having a 2-foot by 2-foot open window in the middle of February letting air into your house. That's how much air infiltration you get in your house. So that's not great. And if you could plug that, just insulate those rural houses and put all new infrastructure in the downtown of the little villages, you'd have a big part of demand reduction, and then you could deal with the questions around moving around.
So I think, demand reduction and restructuring how we think about these rural communities is critical. And the other thing is that no matter what, we'll still have energy needs. And I think one of the challenges that comes with the dispersed rural population is grid reliability, right? I mean, to the point like Lucas is talking about, if we start to build more renewable energy generation assets, they might be located in isolated areas where nobody else is. And you're talking about those electrons are going to feed the first load they find. Well, how far do they have to go, right? And if during weather events, these transmission lines have issues, they can knock out huge pockets, right? Huge pockets of the population from one challenge, right? And so I think this is where you see, again, when trying to address through technology, microgrids and reliability of this idea of coupling your F-150 Lightning there as your backup power, your solar panels on your roof, and you build your isolated network, right? But then you also, as I said, you see these solar panels coming up, not just in people's home, but community solar, right? So that we can scale more appropriately, right? And you can then service a whole array of homes, and you get it located near them, right? Proximity becomes so important. So I think that grid reliability is another big challenge, that as we think about reforming the physical structure and layout of these communities, how do we think about ensuring that they have access to power generation and energy storage for their needs?
Well, I spend a lot of time in rural Nova Scotia and playing in the woods. And everybody I meet out there is very proud and fiercely independent, and good for them. And I like that. I think to add to the conversation, I'd say that virtually all of them have an electricity line going to their house in the rural area. So the infrastructure is already built for them, which is fantastic. And it should not be lost on people that are making policy decisions or supporting technologies or creating programs to support evolution of the rural areas, to recognize that they already have that electrical hookup, and electrification is an answer for them. Other technologies that we might promote, that are urban oriented, may not be deployable there. And so we have to make sure that we take into account those folks and provide them with electricity technologies.
Great, thank you. So we are, it's 7:20. So I'm going to do one last question or two as we wrap up. And this is one, I don't know if you have pencils and if you can do it in your mind, but it's a calculation question. And I was thinking, oh, this is a great one. How many solar panels, wind turbines, storage would we need to have Nova Scotia 100% supplied by renewable energy? Anybody done the math on that?
Big number, right?
Well, the average electricity load in Nova Scotia is something like 1,200 megawatts. And that just represents your electrical load. You have all your home heating as well, and your transportation. So I would say you probably would need 4 gigawatts continuous on average, because home heating loads are very substantial, as is the transportation sector. So let's say 4 gigawatts. Capacity factor of wind turbines in Nova Scotia is usually between 30 and 40%. So I'm just going to multiply by 3. So about 12 gigawatts of wind turbines would need to go in. And of course, there's those days when it's blowing real well, where again, you'd have excess, and other days when it's not blowing very much, or you get an icing situation in February, and all the wind turbines, well, most of the wind turbines shut down. So you need lots and lots and lots of energy storage to go on that. So we studied this a couple of years ago, and I'd encourage you to take a look at the numbers, because I can't remember them all. But it's expensive, and it requires a lot. And I guess you should prepare for that if you fundamentally believe that we should be exclusively powered by renewable energy.
Okay, thank you. Anything's possible. Anything's possible. I agree with that comment. Okay, here's our last question. Is any of the panelists aware of any studies that compare the full carbon footprint, including transportation, of newer, higher density housing in mixed-use centers, usually concrete construction with high embodied energy, versus low-rise, single-family neighborhoods, predominantly wood construction? Any comments on the research on that? So comparing, you know what the question is, yep.
Yeah, I can't give you the numbers on that. I don't know. So I can't answer honestly, but I can say that concrete does bring a huge embodied carbon imprint, and there's many other ways of building than concrete.
Okay. And then our last question to just wrap it up, what are some practical ways people can save energy or make their energy usage more efficient and less wasteful? I think that's a nice question to round us off. Chris, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of obvious things that people know to do, and I think it's about training and habits, right? I think that it's not lost on people how to walk about your daily life and understand when you're consuming energy, when you're having higher energy consumption, and what you can do to play your small role. And that's really the key, is that no single person is going to feel like they move the needle, right? You know, so he's talking about gigawatts of continuous storage. I have 9.8 kilowatts of panels on my house, just trying to do my little part, right? And that's everything from chasing the kids around and turning the light switches off to anything else. And then, of course, you know, there are tiers of things you can do when you get into, again, how much your home consumes power, and what are those projects that should be priorities around lowering, you know, your energy profile and your embedded carbon.
In some sense, it comes down to the question of values, like what do we value as a society, and how do you practice those values? And as you know, in any domain of your life, you practice it in many, many, many different ways. And people from different socioeconomic classes, different ages, different opportunities, different circumstances will have very different levels of agency in what they can do. But I do think if we work as a society as a whole and we hold our governments to account, we ask for the kinds of programs that can support people to make the changes they need, and then we try to mobilize support for research and then make sure that research is going to areas where it actually needs to happen, that it's mobilized well, and other changes are made. So in a sense, it's a little bit like when you look at ecology, you can't just focus on one thing. It's not just an engineering problem, it's a contextual problem. And the broader scope we can present, if you want to call it two-eyed seeing, whatever you want to call it, this larger sense of how we grasp things, and then as we do what we do so well, which is parcel out problems and solve them, that we make sure we're addressing those range of things, from demand management to energy storage to sustainable sourcing, to really use, loved what you said about lightweight lithium batteries is good for commercial items and commodities, like little things that you buy, and that's where the markets are, and that's going to drive it. On the other hand, you have these big, big challenges that have to be dealt with at a larger level. And I think if we recognize that our society spans from the small scale to the big scale, and includes everyone, then we're in a much better place to make some real change.
I got it. Energy literacy. I talk with people, I'm an energy engineer, that's what I am. I talk with people all the time who don't understand the units, they don't understand where the costs are going, they don't understand where the efficiencies and the heat is lost. And if you take it upon yourself, which you're clearly doing here tonight, to learn those aspects and try to understand them, then you will be the ones making the better decision for you each and every day to reduce your energy impacts, to reduce the energy you consume, or to convert that energy more efficiently to use less primary energy in the first place. And only you can make that decision for yourself. And so encourage everyone you know to learn about energy, to learn about energy cost structures, to learn about where energy comes from, and I think that will net benefit our whole society. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So we're just going to wrap up here, and I'll give each panelist 1 minute for any final concluding thoughts.
I think one topic we didn't touch tonight is nuclear, right? And I think nuclear is a topic that's really important to consider when we think about energy transition and the growth of demand on our energy grid and the idea of base load and variable loads. And I think everybody can have their own opinion of nuclear, but when you start to, this idea of energy literacy, you start to look at some of the graphs and the total energy consumption or energy utility that comes from fossil fuels today. These are daunting numbers, right, on a global scale. And, you know, you love seeing the figures that show a tiny little pixel over in Arizona that says that much solar panel could power the entire United States. But when you want to talk about base load and people want to talk about a carbon-free grid, you know, I think people really need to think about the critical role that nuclear can play.
Okay. Christine.
Yeah, I just want to say I've learned a lot in this session. Thank you so much from my fellow panelists, and thank you all for being such a interested audience. I think it's a really important topic, and I don't think I want to repeat anything I've said before, but it's been a real honor to sit here and learn so much about energy. Thanks.
I would encourage you to look at energy projects with open eyes and thoughtful engagement. Having worked in the wind energy sector for a long time, at the beginning, there was a lot of excitement around it. And as it went on over the years, there has been a strong negative connotation that has come about, mostly unwarranted in my opinion. And so I think, if anything, as a society, we should try to look fondly on the fact that things that are producing energy in a low-impact fashion for us, for our uses, the uses that you use and the uses that I use, that we should look fondly on those devices as helpful machinery and things that are nearby us, and have an understanding that they have a very important role to play, and respect them for that. And I'm talking about the machines that do it. And so having an energy generating device in your community should be seen as personal pride. Thank you.
So I do want to thank our panelists, Christine Macy, Dr. Chris Burns, and Dr. Lucas Swan. And I also want to thank the organizers today, Kirsten, Allison, and Colette, for organizing today's session, of course, photography and audio visual, and of course our audience online and here today. And I know that we didn't answer all your questions, and I will probably be here for a couple of minutes, so if you did want to come up and talk to people, that would be great. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.